I want to talk about something really simple. Can you tell the difference between a 24 megapixel image and a 44 megapixel image? How much of a difference is there in that final image that you are looking at when you compare the two different megapixel counts? Because talking about megapixels always brings up quite a big debate. There is that age-old myth that more megapixels equals better image quality, but it doesn't quite work like that. Even though these days cameras are being released with higher megapixel counts, and even some phones now are being released with 50, 80, even 100 megapixels, which is just nuts. But it does make you wonder, just how much of a difference does it make, and can you actually notice any of it when you are viewing that final image? So I thought what I'd do to put this to the test is go out and do some photography and take exactly the same images on two very different cameras. So here I have the Lumix S1II and the Lumix S1RII. They look identical from the outside, but inside they are very different. I'm not going to go into all of that in this video, but essentially the S1II has a 24 megapixel sensor and the S1RII has a 44 megapixel sensor. So I'm going to go and take the same photo on both cameras as closely as I possibly can, down to the same settings, same focal length, same lenses, same composition, everything as close as I possibly can. Then I'm going to come back and edit them exactly the same, look at them on the screen and maybe print a couple of them as well, and see how much of a difference you can actually see between the two different megapixel counts. I honestly don't know how different the outcome will be between the two, but what I do know is it will probably surprise you. So I have an image set up here that I'm going to capture on both cameras. I'm going to start with the S1R2 just because I've got it set up already here on a tripod. I'm using a tripod so I can match the images up on both cameras as closely as I possibly can. The only thing that is going to differ slightly is the conditions, because the sun is going in and out behind a cloud over here as it comes up. I managed to capture this image with some nice morning light hitting that factory over there, but I think that might be gone now, so I'm going to have to try and catch it as the conditions are now with the sun behind the clouds, which bit of a shame, but it's not the end of the world. So yeah, I'm going to start with the S1R2. So I'm shooting on the 24-60 at 43mm. My settings are ISO 100, aperture of f8 and a shutter speed of 20th of a second. So I'm going to get that on the S1R2, switch over to the S1II, same lens, same settings, and yeah, see if we can see any difference between the two. Right, and I'm now filming this on the S1R2, and I've switched over to take the photo on the S1II. Got it set up pretty much exactly the same, and I've been very lucky, and I've got some morning light in both images just hitting the far bit of the factory just down there, which looks really nice. So hopefully we've got these images matched up as closely as we possibly can. We're at ISO 100 f8 again, and the shutter speed this time is a 40th of a second because it's a little bit brighter. So I'm just going to grab one more image exactly the same on both cameras. This time though, I'll be honest, I've not put that much thought into the composition of the image itself. It's just going to be looking straight out over this lake towards those trees over there. And the reason I'm doing this is because I think it might be quite interesting to see the difference between the two images when you start to crop in towards some trees in the distance, because there's a lot of detail in those trees. So what's the difference going to be like when you start to crop in? Can you see much of a difference between the 24 and the 44 megapixel sensors? So I'm going to start with the S1R2 again, just because I've got it set up. Take the same settings again, so ISO 100 and f11 this time. Okay, so I am back home now, and I have imported the 4 images that I've taken on both cameras, so 2 on each camera, into Lightroom. You can see them here in my library, and I have just made some very slight edits, just very basic stuff, just to match them up as best I can, because like I mentioned when I was out and about, the light was changing, so even though I was quick with changing over cameras and lenses, things had changed from the couple of minutes that it took me between the shots. So here is one image shot on one of the cameras, the first image shot on one of the cameras, sorry, and here is the first image shot on the second camera. I'm not going to tell you which way around it is just yet, as long as I've not left it on the screen anywhere, which I haven't. And here is the second image taken on the first camera and the second image taken on the second camera. Now the chances are, just looking at them like that, if I didn't tell you which was shot on which camera, you're not going to be able to tell the difference at all, because they are fairly small here as you look at them in Lightroom. But one thing that I want to mention very quickly is that when you are looking at your images on a monitor, now I'm going to speak broadly here, but most monitors these days are around 4K. Obviously we've got some with higher resolution, but most images that we are looking at on around about a 4K monitor. A 4K monitor works out at about the equivalent of 8 megapixels. Now that might sound a little bit mad, because it did to me when I first learnt it. If you are shooting with a camera with anything above 8 megapixels, you still have more information in that file that your monitor can actually show you. So in this case, we have 24 and 44 megapixel images. When we're looking at them just as a whole image like that, there is way more information in that file than our monitor is actually showing us. And that is why when you start to crop in, you start to notice some images break up more than others, because you're losing resolution as you crop in. So a 12 megapixel image, for example, as you crop in, will break up quicker than a 44 megapixel image, obviously, because there is far less megapixels to work with as you start to crop in. And I think a lot of people tend to forget that, because there is this common misconception that more megapixels tends to equal better image quality. And I don't know if that is a thing since cameras in smartphones have started to improve, and you see cameras with like 80 megapixels now, and people think that's going to take amazing photos, but then it just doesn't work like that. More megapixels doesn't equal better image quality. There are going to be times when more megapixels do help. If you're a wildlife photographer, for example, and you want a little bit of room for cropping, that can be very useful. If you're a high-end studio portrait photographer, product photographer, or you're going to be creating massive prints, and I mean massive prints. I'm going to talk more about prints briefly in a little bit as well. That's when more megapixels can become useful. But for the majority of things, if you're just going to be looking at your images on monitors and on social media, megapixels aren't as big of an issue as people might think they are. So I've lined these images up side by side so we can try and see the differences between the two. So on the left, we have the S1II image, and on the right, we have the S1R2 image. So we have 44 megapixels on the right, 24 megapixels on the left. As you look at them side by side, you're obviously not going to be able to tell the difference, apart from the lighting conditions like I've mentioned, but they are fairly small thumbnails, and there is way more information than the monitor can actually show you. So you will start to notice the difference when you zoom in. So let's zoom into this lorry here, for example. We're not seeing a drastic amount of difference between the two. The 24 megapixel on the left is still not starting to break up. We're cropped into 67% and 50% on the S1R2 with 44 megapixels. And even though they are framed fairly similar, they're similar size, there's not really a big difference between the two. Let's go in even further, maybe to this 23 on the back of the lorry. There is when you can start to notice the difference, and we're all the way zoomed in to 400% on the 24 megapixel image, and you can just about start to see the detail in the line between the white and the green. There's more detail in the 44 megapixel one on the right. But look how far we are zoomed in. It is honestly much closer than I first thought it would be. Where you can see a real difference though is in the fence here. You can see it really starting to break up in the wire of the fence, but on the right there is so much more detail. There is a lot more detail in the S1R2 on the right, but you can only see that when you really start to zoom in right to the lorry, which is absolutely crazy. Let's just go to a different part of the image to see if we can see any more differences. Let's go to the branches on the building just up here. It is marginal, it really is. They are both incredibly sharp. The image on the left, you can see around the rust here is just starting to break up, whereas there's far more detail in 44 megapixels on the right. But again, 300% zoomed in on the 24 megapixel image. It is absolutely marginal. I'm genuinely surprised as to how close it is, but if you are zooming in this far to your images, I want to know what you're doing with your images, because no one is doing that. If you look at them side by side like that, there is absolutely no difference at all. And let's very quickly look at these two images. Again, we have the S1II with 24 megapixels on the left and the S1R2 on the right. As you look at them side by side, again, small thumbnails, you're not going to notice the difference between the two. Around the top of this tree here, this is where I thought it would be quite noticeable with trees, because there is so much detail in trees when you're shooting trees, especially in the distance. You can start to really see the image breaking up around the top of the tree here, but on the right, there is still a lot more detail in the branches and the leaves. And as we go down here, there is definitely a little bit more definition in the 44 megapixels on the right as we get into the really heavy woodland area just there. On the left, it doesn't look bad considering how far zoomed in we are. It does just go a little bit more mushy because there's less resolution to work with. And if we look at the birds in the lake here, maybe see that there's a little bit more detail in the back of the bird on just here, a little bit more detail in the feathers on the back if you compare it to the one on the left. But again, the differences are a lot smaller than I first thought they would be. It has actually shocked me quite a lot. I thought there would be a difference, but a bigger difference than there actually is. It surprised me quite a lot. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to print all 4 of these images onto some nice paper using this printer behind me and see if you can see any differences in the actual final prints. Right, here we are. We have 4 prints, 2 of each image shot on the same, or different cameras, sorry, not the same camera. So one of these was shot on the S1II, one was shot on the S1R2. I've written on the front, so you can probably tell which is which, but they look identical. I honestly, even I am a little bit surprised as to how close this is. I know when I said I was looking at them on the screen, they looked similar, but when you really zoomed in, then you could start to see the differences in the fence down by the lorry. But when you're looking at them in print, I know they're not massive prints, they're only A4 size, but they look even more similar. They're so sharp, both of them. One thing I have noticed is on the S1II image, and I don't know if there's a reason for this, it might just be something to do with where the light was, with it moving slightly when I took both of the images. But on the S1II in the fence, I don't know how well you can see it on camera, but there is a little bit of moire in the fence where it's, I don't know what's caused it, because it's not on the S1R2, which does surprise me a little bit. I thought it would have been the other way around. If I didn't have it written on which one it was taken on, S1II, S1R2, I wouldn't be able to know the difference between them. Now, a lot of that is down to the fact that resolution works a little bit differently on paper to how it does on a monitor. So I mentioned earlier on that a 4K monitor is the equivalent of around 8 megapixels. On paper, it is even finer, so you have much higher resolution on paper to a monitor, which means that you can blow these up pretty big and still get really impressive results. Obviously, you will be able to blow the 44 megapixel image up a little bit bigger than the 24 megapixel image, but that being said, this image that I have up here, this is printed in A2 size. This is a picture that I took a couple of years ago on a 24 megapixel sensor. I'm going to go this way so you can not get the reflection. This is A2. This is huge, but this is taken on a 24 megapixel camera and it looks amazing. It is so sharp. I could probably have printed this even bigger as well, which just goes to show how much detail is actually in a 24 megapixel image. And you don't need to be getting caught up on 24 megapixels isn't enough, because usually it absolutely is for 99% of things. And when you look at them A4 sized and compare the two, let's have a look at this other image of the trees. Again, they look absolutely identical, and viewing distance plays a huge part as well. When you are viewing images in print, you're not going to be viewing them up really closely and properly pixel people like that. You're going to be looking at the whole image. So you've got to take into account viewing distance as well, which is something that you don't always take into account when you are viewing on a monitor. Viewing images on paper is very different, but you have so much detail in the 24 megapixel image that you do not need to be worried about it at all. And that, I think, is a little bit of a reminder you don't always need to be looking for a higher megapixel camera because it's not always needed. And this is one of the reasons why that when people ask me about this, I always say that 24 megapixels is more than enough for most photographers. It prints beautifully up to A2 size and even bigger. And also the other thing to take into account is when you're working with the files on your computer, the files at 24 megapixels are much smaller than the 44 megapixel files. That means that your whole workflow can just be a lot smoother, faster and easier, and it means that you don't need huge amounts of storage as well. And honestly, it can just be a little bit more of a relaxed way of working. But most people as well don't tend to print much bigger than A4, A3. My printer prints a max of A3 plus, so if I wanted something A2 size, I would have to send off to a print lab for it. But that's very rare because most of the prints that I'm happy with and the size I'm happy with is A4. I'll occasionally do a couple of A3 if I wanted to print something a little bit bigger, but as well I tend to print images a lot smaller than this. I would do half of this, which I think works out about A5, and I'll do 2 prints on each sheet. So 24 megapixels is absolutely more than enough for all of that any day of the week. Now, I'm not saying that high resolution is pointless, because it is absolutely not, and it has a lot of use cases for a lot of people. The 44 megapixel S1R II is incredible for portraits, landscapes, detailed product shots, or something where you want a little bit of room for extra cropping, or you want to be printing massive prints. And I mean massive. You can see how big you can print 24 megapixel images. You can go incredibly large with 44 megapixel images. I love the S1R II. It is my go-to camera for 99% of my photography. I adore this thing. It is incredible. But the thing to remember is that high resolution is a tool. It's not essential and it's not a requirement. And it makes sense for some photographers, but it shouldn't be the main thing that you're chasing, a high resolution camera. Don't get pulled into the whole more megapixels equals better image quality debate, because that is just not a thing to take into consideration at all, because it's just not the way that it works in the slightest. And there's plenty more things to think about that have way more impact on your final image. Even if you're only going to be sharing images on social media, a lot of the time 12 megapixels is going to be plenty, especially when it is compressed to within an inch of its life on the likes of Instagram. So I think the biggest takeaway for me is this, and that is that more megapixels are a nice to have. They are by no means essential. Even I'm a little bit shocked as to how close the results are. Even when you're looking at them on a monitor, there are some very slight differences, and yes, it is definitely sharper using a higher megapixel sensor. However, the results are that close, and especially when you start printing your images as well, the results are minimal, and it doesn't make as big of a difference as even I was expecting. If you want to be improving your photography, there is loads of other things to be taking into consideration that actually have a dramatic impact on your final images, and that is things like composition, lighting, colors, and the printing process. Those are just a few of the more important things to be thinking about when you are trying to learn and develop your skills as a photographer and improve your final images, not by buying a higher megapixel camera because you think that will make a big difference, because like shown in this image, that makes such a small difference to the final outcome. And where you actually see big results in your final images is by putting time and effort into developing new skills and learning new things. At the end of the day, a camera is just a tool, and they all do exactly the same thing, just in slightly different ways. And it doesn't matter how many megapixels a camera has, as long as it does what you need it to do. And if you have 12 megapixels, 24 megapixels, 60 megapixels, who cares? It really doesn't matter, because the main thing that makes a big difference to your image quality is developing your skills as a photographer, as I've just proven with this, because the difference between the final prints is absolutely minimal. I couldn't tell if I hadn't written it on which was which. It is so close, and that has surprised me a little bit. I thought there would be a bigger difference between the two. Maybe if I printed them a little bit bigger, then I'd start to notice a bit of a difference, but even on a screen it was really hard to tell. So that is it for this video. If you liked it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you like what you see as well. It helps out way more than you could possibly imagine, and it is massively appreciated as well. If you want to see any more videos on printing, let me know in the comments down below. And if you want to watch another video all about the Lumix S1RII, I recommend you go and watch this one next, and I'll see you there.